struggling cowboy lost his herd. Until a widow offered to trade her child, Jake Morrow lost everything in 3 years. His cattle, his land, his father's good name. But when a desperate widow whispered an offer that would haunt his dreams, he realized some bargains cost more than money. They cost your soul. The dust never settled right in Jake Morrow's world anymore. It hung in the air like guilt, coating everything with the fine grit of failure. 3 years since the drought began. 3 years since his cattle started dying, their bones bleaching white under a sun that forgot how to bring rain. Now he rode his lame mare through what used to be grazing land, counting the ghosts of 1,000 head of beef that once made his father proud. The horse limped beneath him, favoring her left front hoof the way Jake favored his pride, carefully, knowing it might give out completely if pushed too hard. Behind them, the dust cloud of his passage settled into the cracked earth like a prayer that would never be answered. Millfield appeared on the horizon like a mirage, but Jake knew better than to hope. Towns like this died slow deaths, one empty storefront at a time. The main street stretched before him, lined with buildings that leaned on each other for support, their paint peeled away by wind and neglect. A few horses stood tied to hitching posts, their heads hanging low in the heat. Jake's stomach cramped with hunger. 3 days since his last real meal. The 23 cents in his pocket wouldn't buy much, but it might get him a cup of coffee and a hard biscuit. Maybe the general store owner would let him work for food, though Jake's reputation rode ahead of him these days. Men who lost their herds to poor judgment weren't trusted with much. He dismounted outside Henley's general store, his boots hitting the wooden walkway with a hollow sound. The mare snorted and shook her head, and Jake ran his hand along her neck. "I know, girl. I know." The store's door stood open, trying to catch any breeze that might wander through. Inside, shelves lined the walls, some bare, others holding the basic needs of frontier life: flour, beans, ammunition, rope. The smell of tobacco and leather mixed with something else, something that reminded Jake of better times. At the counter, a woman counted coins from a small cloth purse. Her hair was black as coal smoke, pulled back tight, and when she turned, Jake saw the careful lines around her eyes that spoke of worry worn deep. Her dress was plain cotton, mended in places but clean. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned not to waste motion or words. Behind the counter, old Henley watched them both with the patient eyes of a man who'd seen too many desperate people come through his door. "Afternoon," Jake said, touching the brim of his hat. The woman nodded but didn't speak. She was buying beans and flour, Jake noticed. Not much of either. Her coins clinked as she counted them twice, then once more. "That'll be $1.40, Henley said, not unkindly. The woman's fingers hesitated over her purse. Jake could see her adding numbers in her head, the same way he'd been doing for months. The arithmetic of survival never got easier. She placed the coins on the counter, one by one. $1.37. 3 cents short. The silence stretched between them all, thick as the dust outside. Jake felt something twist in his chest. Recognition, maybe. The sharp edge of knowing exactly how those 3 missing cents felt. Henley started to speak, but Jake stepped forward. His hand found the 23 cents in his pocket. "I'll cover the difference," he said quietly. The woman turned to look at him fully for the first time. Her eyes were dark brown, almost black, and they held the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Something passed between them in that moment. Not attraction, but understanding. The deep recognition of 2 people who'd both learned to count coins twice. "You don't need to," she said. Her voice carried a slight accent, something that spoke of distant places. "I know," Jake replied. He placed 3 cents on the counter. "But I'm going to." Henley bagged her purchases without comment. Small-town wisdom knew when to stay quiet. The woman gathered her parcels, then paused at the door. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Sarah Chen." "Jake Morrow." She nodded once, then stepped outside. Through the window, Jake watched her load her supplies into a wagon that had seen better decades. A small face peered around the wagon's edge. A child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair like her mother's. "That's a good woman," Henley said, breaking the quiet. Lost her husband last winter. Been struggling ever since. Jake ordered his coffee and biscuit, using the rest of his coins. As he ate, he watched Sarah Chen drive her wagon down the dusty street. The child sat beside her, small hands gripping the wagon's side. Got a little girl, Henley continued, wiping down the counter. Sweet thing. Name's Lily. Jake sipped his coffee, feeling its warmth fight against the cold knot in his stomach. Through the window, he could see Sarah's wagon turning at the edge of town, heading toward the scattered homesteads that dotted the prairie beyond. Hard times for folks like her, Jake said. Hard times for everyone, Henley replied, though some got it worse than others. The coffee was bitter, but Jake drank it all. Outside, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rust and gold. Soon it would be dark, and he needed to find a place to sleep. His horse needed rest, and so did he. But as he finished his meager meal, Jake found himself thinking about Sarah Chen's careful counting, her quiet dignity, the way she'd thanked him for 3 cents. Most of all, he thought about the child beside her on that weathered wagon seat. Hard times made people do things they never thought they'd do. As Jake stepped back into the dusty street, he wondered what desperate measures tomorrow might bring, and whether he'd have the strength to face them with anything resembling honor. When Sarah Chen opened her door that night, she expected to find a drifter looking for shelter. Instead, she found a broken cowboy with a proposal so desperate, so unthinkable, that would test everything she thought she knew about love and survival. Sarah Chen's cabin crouched against the prairie like a wounded animal seeking shelter. The wind found every crack in the weathered boards, whistling through gaps that should have been chinked with mud and hope. Inside, a single candle fought against the darkness, its flame dancing to the rhythm of drafts that carried the scent of coming winter. Lily sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, drawing horses with a stick. Her pictures were all legs and manes, the way children see the world, full of movement and possibility. She hummed while she drew, a soft melody that Sarah's mother had sung in the old country, before railroads and promises had carried them all so far from home. Sarah counted their remaining supplies for the 3rd time that evening. 2 pounds of flour, a handful of beans, some salt pork that would last maybe 4 more meals if she was careful. The arithmetic was simple and brutal. They had enough food for a week, maybe 2 if they ate like sparrows. The knock on the door came just as full darkness settled over the land. Lily looked up from her drawings, eyes wide. Visitors after dark usually brought trouble or sorrow, sometimes both. Sarah moved to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. A man stood on her small porch, hat in his hands. She recognized him from the general store, the cowboy who'd paid for her beans. Mom. His voice carried clearly through the thin door. It's Jake Morrow. From town today. I wonder if I might have a word. Sarah hesitated. Her husband's rifle hung above the door, loaded but dusty. Tom had taught her to shoot before the consumption took him, but she'd never pointed it at a living soul. It's late, Mr. Morrow, she called back. Yes, ma'am. I know, but I've got something to discuss. Something that might help us both. The word help hung in the night air like a promise. Sarah had learned to be suspicious of promises, but desperation was a powerful thing. She lifted the wooden bar from the door and opened it just wide enough to see his face. Jake Morrow looked different in the candlelight. Older, maybe. The lines around his eyes deeper than she'd noticed in the store. His clothes were clean but worn, and he held his hat like a man asking for forgiveness. What kind of help? She asked. He glanced past her at Lily, who had moved closer to listen. Maybe we could talk outside? On the porch. Sarah looked back at her daughter, then stepped outside, pulling the door most of the way closed behind her. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. Jake's horse stood tied to her fence post, and she could see the exhaustion in the animal's stance. I heard about your husband, Jake said quietly. I'm sorry for your loss. Sarah nodded. Words of sympathy were common as dust out here. Everyone lost someone to something, sickness, accident, violence, or simple despair. Thank you, she said. But you didn't ride out here in the dark to offer condolences. Jake looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. No, ma'am. I didn't. He took a breath that seemed to cost him something. I lost my herd 3 years back. Drought took most of them. Rustlers got the rest. Been trying to rebuild ever since, but he gestured at the empty darkness around them. Hard to make something from nothing. Sarah waited. She'd learned that men often needed time to work up to what they really wanted to say. Got creditors coming for what's left of my land. Jake continued. Bank notes due in 6 weeks. Don't have the money and won't have it in time. I'm sorry to hear that, Sarah said, though she wondered why he was telling her his troubles. She had enough of her own. Jake raised his eyes to meet hers. In the starlight, they looked haunted. Thing is, I got an idea. A way we might both get what we need. What's that? The silence stretched between them. From inside the cabin came the soft sound of Lily humming her grandmother's song. Your little girl, Jake said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She needs food, shelter, a future. I can provide all that if I can get back on my feet. And I need someone to help me prove to the bank that I'm responsible. I've got family stability. Sarah felt something cold crawl up her spine. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Morrow? A trade, he said, the word coming out like they were cutting his throat. Temporary like. Lily comes with me for a year, maybe 2. I get my land back, rebuild the herd. You get to know she's fed and safe. While I'm back on my feet, we work out the details. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stepped back, her hand finding the door frame for support. You want me to give you my child? I want to help you both survive, Jake said quickly. I've seen what happens to women out here with no means. I've seen the children who don't make it through winter. This way you get free labor, and I get to pretend my daughter isn't being sold like cattle. Jake flinched as if she'd struck him. It's not like that. I treat her like my own. I swear on my father's grave, I'd never hurt her. She'd be safe, fed, warm. She'd be mine no longer. The door creaked behind them, and Lily's small face appeared in the gap. Mama, is everything all right? Sarah's heart clenched. Her daughter's face was thinner than it had been a month ago. The careful portions, the skipped meals, the nights when Sarah went hungry so Lily could have a little more. It was all there in the sharp angle of the child's cheekbones. Everything's fine, sweetheart, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. Go back to your drawings. Lily disappeared back into the cabin, but Sarah could feel her listening. Jake's voice was softer now, desperate. I know how it sounds, but winter's coming, and you don't have enough food to last. I can see in your face the way you counted those coins today. How long before you're choosing between heating the cabin and buying flour? Sarah closed her eyes. The terrible thing was he was right. She'd been doing that arithmetic for weeks, and the numbers never came out in her favor. She's all I have left of him, Sarah whispered. And she's all you have left, period, Jake replied. This way, she stays alive. Grows up strong. Has a chance. A coyote called somewhere in the darkness, its voice lonely and wild. Sarah thought of Tom, buried under the oak tree behind the cabin. What would he tell her to do? What choice would a good mother make when all the choices were bad? I need time to think, she said. Jake nodded, settling his hat back on his head. Yes, ma'am. But don't take too long. Winter waits for no one, and neither do bank notes. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Sarah alone with the weight of impossible decisions and the sound of her daughter's soft humming drifting through the cabin walls. For 3 weeks, they pretended it was just business, a desperate arrangement between strangers. But when little Lily started calling him Papa Jake, and Sarah began mending his shirts, they realized some bargains change more than circumstances. They change hearts. The morning Sarah knocked on Jake's cabin door, she carried only a small bundle of Lily's clothes and a heart heavy as winter stone. Her daughter's hand felt bird-small in hers, trusting and warm. Behind them, their own cabin stood empty, its door latched against a future that might never come. I can't pay you back in money, Sarah had said 3 days earlier, her voice hollow with defeat. But I can work. I can cook, mend, tend animals. And Lily. She couldn't finish the sentence. Jake had nodded, understanding, filling the spaces between words. A year, he'd promised. Maybe less if things go well with the bank. Now, 3 weeks later, the arrangement had settled into something that felt less like business and more like the ghost of family. Jake's cabin, which had echoed with loneliness for so long, now hummed with the soft sounds of living. Sarah's quiet humming as she cooked, Lily's laughter when Jake taught her to rope fence posts, the gentle murmur of bedtime stories drifting through thin walls. Sarah had claimed the small room that had once been Jake's father's study, while Lily slept on a cot near the kitchen stove. Jake gave them space, privacy, careful not to assume more than their desperate bargain allowed. But in the evening hours, when the day's work was done and the prairie wind sang through the eaves, they found themselves sharing the kitchen table like people who belonged together. "She's got good hands," Jake said one evening, watching Lily practice her rope work on a wooden chair. "Quick learner, too." Sarah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. Her father was good with his hands. Could fix anything, build anything. The sadness that usually followed mention of Tom was softer now, worn smooth by time and the strange comfort of being needed again. Jake had grown careful with his word around Sarah, measuring each one like precious grain. But he'd grown careless with his heart, letting it warm to the sound of her moving through his kitchen, to the way she folded his shirts with the same care she gave her daughter's dresses. The bank examiner arrived on a Thursday, riding a well-fed horse and wearing clothes that had never known honest dirt. Mr. Garrison was his name, and he carried papers and judgment in equal measure. "So this is your family, Morrow?" Garrison's eyes took in the cabin, Sarah at the stove, Lily playing quietly with a corn husk doll. "Yes, sir," Jake said, the lies sticking in his throat like dry bread. Sarah turned from the stove, wiping her hands on her apron. Jake saw her straighten, saw the careful way she arranged her face into something that looked like contentment. "Mr. Garrison," she said, offering a slight nod. "I hope you'll stay for dinner. It's nothing fancy, but there's plenty. That's kind of you, Mrs. Chun," Sarah said without hesitation. Sarah Chun. Garrison's eyebrows lifted slightly at the Chinese surname, but his expression remained professional. "And the little one? That's Lily," Jake said, his voice steadier now. "She's 7. Lily looked up from her doll, offering the shy smile that had been melting Jake's resistance for weeks. "Hello, mister." "Hello there, child." They ate dinner at the small table, rabbit stew thick with vegetables from Sarah's struggling garden, biscuits that were somehow light despite the coarse flour, coffee that tasted like civilization. Garrison asked careful questions about their circumstances, their plans, the state of Jake's rebuilding efforts. "The herd's coming along," Jake said, which was true. He'd managed to buy 6 head of cattle with money earned from odd jobs around town. "Not much, but a start. And you're comfortable here, Mrs. Chun?" Garrison asked. "It's isolated country for a woman with a child." Sarah's hand found Lily's across the table. "We manage well enough. Mr. Morrow is a good man, a good provider." The words hung in the air between truth and performance, but Jake felt them settle around his heart like a blessing he hadn't earned. After Garrison left with promises to review the paperwork, Jake stood on his porch watching the man's dust trail disappear into twilight. Sarah joined him, Lily playing at their feet with a collection of smooth stones. "Think he believed us?" Jake asked. "Does it matter?" Sarah's voice was quiet, thoughtful. "All of us. That's what families do, isn't it?" Before Jake could answer, the sound of horses reached them from a distance. Not one horse, but several moving fast. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward the rifle propped beside the door. "Get inside," he said quietly. Sarah scooped Lily up without question, her movements quick and sure. Jake had seen that look before, the careful alertness of someone who'd learned that safety was always temporary on the frontier. 3 riders emerged from the dusk, their faces hard under the brims of pulled-low hats. Jake recognized the man in front, Ben Sawyer, one of his creditors. The 2 men flanking him wore guns like they knew how to use them. "Evening, Morrow," Sawyer called, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man holding all the cards. "Sawyer." Jake stepped forward, putting himself between the riders and his cabin. "Little late for a social call." "Not social," Sawyer said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. Business. Heard you had company. Heard you've been playing house. Jake's jaw tightened. My personal affairs aren't your concern. They're when they involve my money. Sawyer pulled a folded paper from his coat. New terms, Morrow. Bank's getting nervous about your loan. They want additional collateral. What kind of collateral? Sawyer's smile was thin as winter ice. The kind that works in kitchens and sleeps warm at night. The meaning hit Jake like a physical blow. His hand moved toward his gun, but Sawyer's men were ready, their own weapons half drawn. Now, Sawyer said, his voice mockingly gentle. No need for unpleasantness. Just business, like I said. You default on that loan, and everything on this property becomes bank property. Everything. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. Behind him, through the cabin's thin walls, he could hear Sarah humming softly to Lily, the same melody she sang every night. That's not legal, Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Legal's what men with money say it is, Sawyer replied. You've got until the note comes due. 6 weeks, Morrow. Find the money, or find out just how deep your debts really run. The three men mounted their horses and rode away, leaving Jake alone with the weight of promises he might not be able to keep and the terrible knowledge that some bargains had consequences far beyond what any desperate soul could imagine. When a moment came to choose between his word and his conscience, Jake Morrow discovered that some promises are worth breaking, and some families are worth everything. But would his choice come too late to save the people who'd taught him how to love again? The final weeks passed like water through cupped hands. Too fast, too precious, impossible to hold. Jake found himself memorizing the small things. The way Sarah hummed while she kneaded bread, how Lily's laughter echoed across the prairie when she chased the chickens, the quiet contentment that settled over their cabin each evening like a benediction. But underneath the growing warmth lay the cold weight of Sawyer's ultimatum. Lily slept inside, exhausted from a day spent learning to milk their lone cow. Jake stared out at the stars scattered across the endless sky, just thinking about the note. It wasn't a question. Sarah had developed a way of reading his silences that unnerved and comforted him in equal measure. Among other things, he admitted. What other things? Jake turned to look at her. In the moonlight, her face held the same quiet strength he'd first seen in Henley's store, but something had softened around the edges. The desperate wariness had given way to something he was afraid to name. About how different everything feels now, he said. About how I didn't expect. Didn't expect what? Didn't expect to care so much. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Neither did I. The admission hung between them, fragile as spider silk in morning dew. Jake felt his carefully maintained boundaries crumbling, felt the weight of their arrangement shifting into something that had no words, no contracts, no expiration date. Sarah, he began, but she held up a hand. Don't, she said softly. Don't say something you might have to take back in 3 days. 3 days. Jake closed his eyes, feeling the arithmetic of despair settle in his bones. Even if he sold everything, his horse, his tools, his father's watch, he'd still be $800 short. The bank note would come due, and Sawyer would come calling, and everything Jake had built with Sarah and Lily would crumble into dust. The sound of approaching horses reached them just after dawn on the day the note was due. Jake was in the barn, trying to milk their temperamental cow, and failing because his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Through the open door, he saw the riders, Sawyer and his 2 men, plus a 4th figure in a black suit. The banker, Jake realized. Come to collect. Sarah appeared in the barn doorway. Lily pressed close against her side. Take her to the root cellar, Jake said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Jake, please. Just until they're gone. Sarah nodded, understanding. She scooped Lily up and disappeared toward the back of the cabin. Jake straightened his shoulders, said a prayer to his father's ghost, and walked out to meet his reckoning. Morning, Morrow, Sawyer called, his smile sharp as broken glass. Beautiful day to settle debts. The banker dismounted, unfolding papers with the careful precision of a man who'd foreclosed on 100 dreams. Mr. Morrow, I'm here to collect payment on your outstanding loan. The full amount of $1,200. Jake's throat felt lined with sand. I don't have it. We figured as much, Sawyer said. Which means everything on this property now belongs to the bank, including your household arrangements. Leave them out of this. Can't do that, I'm afraid. Your collateral includes all assets and dependents residing on bank property. Jake's hand moved toward his gun, but Sawyer's men were ready. The sound of hammers being pulled back echoed across the yard like breaking bones. Now, Morrow, Sawyer said, his voice mockingly gentle. No need for heroics. The woman and child will be well taken care of. There's always work in the city for folks willing to earn their keep. The meaning behind his words hit Jake like a sledgehammer. He thought of Sarah's quiet dignity, of Lily's trust, of the way they'd both learned to call this place home. The rage that rose in him was pure and clean and utterly without hope. I'll kill you first, Jake said quietly. No, came Sarah's voice from the cabin doorway. You won't. She stepped onto the porch, Lily's small hand clasped in hers. In her other hand, she carried a leather satchel that Jake had never seen before. Because there's another way, Sarah continued, walking slowly toward them. Mr. Sawyer, isn't it? I believe you hear about money. That's right, ma'am. $1,200. Sarah reached into the satchel and pulled out a roll of bills bound with string. Will you count it, or shall I? The silence that followed was so complete Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Sawyer's confident smile flickered and died. Where did you? Jake began. My husband's savings, Sarah said, not taking her eyes off Sawyer. Hidden in our cabin all this time. I couldn't bear to touch it after he died. It felt too much like letting go. She looked at Jake then, and her smile was soft with something that might have been love. But some things are worth letting go for. Sawyer's face had gone pale. The banker stepped forward, counting the bills with shaking fingers. When he finished, he nodded once. $1,200 exactly, he announced. The debt is satisfied. Jake felt his knees threaten to give way. Sarah moved to stand beside him, Lily between them, and for the first time in months, Jake allowed himself to breathe. Seems you win this round, Morrow, Sawyer said, his voice tight with frustrated rage. But don't think this is over. Yes, it is, Jake said, finding his voice again. It's over. After the men rode away, Jake stood in his yard, his own yard now, and tried to process what had happened. Sarah had saved them all, but at what cost? The money, he said. That was everything you had left of him. Sarah nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks. It was. But Tom's been gone a long time, and you're here now. Lily's here now. This is where we belong. Jake reached for her then, pulling her and Lily into an embrace that felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the scent of rain and growing things. I love you, Jake said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. Both of you. I don't know when it happened, but I know, Sarah whispered against his shoulder. I love you too. Lily looked up at them both, her 7-year-old wisdom shining in her dark eyes. Does this mean we can stay, Papa Jake? The word Papa hit Jake like a benediction. He knelt down to Lily's level, cupping her small face in his work-rough hands. Forever, he promised. We're a family now. A real family. 6 months later, Jake stood in the same spot, watching Sarah hang laundry on the line they'd strung between 2 cottonwood trees. Their herd had grown to 20 head, and there was talk of expanding the cabin come spring. Lily ran between the sheets like a ghost playing at haunting, her laughter bright as water over stones. The dust still settled over everything, but now it felt different. Now it felt like home settling into itself, like dreams taking root in soil that had learned to nurture instead of merely endure. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, Jake thought about the bargain that had brought them all together. It had been born of desperation and dressed in the language of transaction, but it had grown into something no contract could contain. Love, he learned, was like water on desert ground. It found its way into the deepest cracks and changed everything from the inside out. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very patient, it taught you that the best promises weren't the ones you kept, but the ones you were brave enough to break when breaking them meant saving something more precious than your word. In the distance, thunder rolled across the sky, and Jake smiled, tasting rain on the wind.